Hello, Mr. Hardy here, and in this video I want to teach you about the poem Papati by Fred de Aguiar. In this video we will read Papati by de Aguiar, and we'll then check our understanding of the poem, we'll explore the message of the poem and the areas of conflict, we'll identify key linguistic, structural and poetic features the poet employs, and then I'll leave you with some post-video tasks, including a question you can answer if you want to get some writing practice in. So, who is our poet, Fred de Aguiar? First of all, I hope I'm pronouncing his surname correctly. I'm not entirely sure. Please correct me in the comments below if I'm not. He was born in 1960 and he's still alive today, so that makes him a contemporary poet who deals with the issues of our times. He is a British Guianese poet. So Guyana is in the continent of South America, and Britain colonised it as part of the British Empire, and it's now referred to as British Guiana. He works as a poet, a novelist, and a playwright. And actually, the last bullet point there shows that he also works as the professor of English at the University of California in North America. When I read this poem and when I studied a bit about de Aguiar, I drew a lot of links to John Agard, the poet of Flag. He is also from British Guyana. He is also contemporaneous. He's still alive today. He deals with issues of our time. So you may want to draw some similarities between these poets and their poems in the conflict anthology. Fred de Aguiar uses his Guyanese Creole. So Creole is the dialect, the type of English that they speak in British Guyana, and it's written phonetically to sort of reflect how they would speak and pronounce and emphasize certain sounds and certain words. And we see some of that in the poem Papati. So let's read it. Papati by Fred de Aguiar. When Grandad recited the Tennyson learned at sea, I saw companies of redcoats tin-soldiering it, through rugged country, picked off one by poison-tipped blow-darts or arrows from nowhere, their drums panicky rattle, their buglers yelp. Musket clap and popping cannons, smoke everywhere. He'd cut short to shout, if you all don't pay me mind, I go and gie you a good licking and send you to bed. Resuming, as he breathed in, his consonants stretched past recall, into a whale's crying place, beginning polyp kingdoms, shipwrecked into Amerindian care for months. We'd sit tight, all eyes on our sweet sea salter, for that last line sound. Someone mistimed once, making him start again. These days, the perfect lined face of a blank page startles at first, like Papati's no-nonsense recitals. It has me itching to bring him, reeling off in that tongue. Honour the charge they made, honour the Light Brigade, noble 600. To hear, to disobey. So that is de Aguiar's three-stanza poem, Papati. So what is it about? In Papati, de Aguiar recalls when his grandfather would recite another poem called The Charge of the Light Brigade by another poet called Alfred Lord Tennyson. The Charge of the Light Brigade poem is based on a real historical event involving the British cavalry and Russian forces during something called the Crimean War in 1854, which is in a region that is modern-day Ukraine. What happened was there was a communication breakdown. The message was to actually make the soldiers retreat away from the Russian guns and cannons, but there was a mistranslation or a miscommunication, and actually the British soldiers were sent towards the Russian guns and cannons, which resulted in a lot of death and heavy casualties. So here is the poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson. And this is the poem that de Aguiar's grandfather would recite to de Aguiar and the other grandkids. The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward. All in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldiers knew. Someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell. Boldly they rode, and well, into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell, rode the 600. Flashed all their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabring the gunners there, charging an army, while all the world wondered. Plunged into the battery smoke, right through the line they broke, Cossack and Russian reeled from the sabre stroke, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back, but not the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon behind them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. They that had fought so well came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell, all that was left of them, left of 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made! All the world wondered. Honour the charge they made, honour the Light Brigade, noble 600. So that poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson, is a historical poem. It basically recounts a battle that had happened during the Crimean War. And this poem was taught for many, many years in school. And I am assuming, since the British conquered Guyana, they brought over some of their education, including this poem, and they taught this poem to Fred the Aguiar's grandfather. And it stirred in him a sort of loyalty to the British Empire. And this loyalty has continued throughout his whole life. And he tries to impart this loyalty to Fred the Aguiar and his other grandkids by reciting this poem to them in the hope that they might memorize it, they might also recite it, and they might also be loyal and grow to love the British Empire. But it doesn't quite go to plan. So let's return to Papati by Fred the Aguiar, and let's explore stanza by stanza what is going on. So here I have stanza 1, and in this stanza, the persona, the voice of the poem, which I think is Fred the Aguiar himself, is recalling their grandfather reciting The Charge of the Light Brigade, that poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson about the Crimean War Battle of Balaclava. However, the persona, confuses some parts of the historical narrative that happened in Ukraine with their Guianese background, which is more of a jungly terrain. For example, line 2, I saw companies of redcoats tin soldiering it. This would have been historically accurate. The British Army often wore redcoats. That was their military uniform. And this idea of them being tin soldiers all lined up with their guns and their sabres going off into battle, this would have been quite accurate. However, we get some jungly references to guerrilla warfare, which just would not have been accurate in modern-day Ukraine, which is where the battle took place. We get references to poison-tipped blow darts. This wouldn't have been the sort of weapons used in Crimea in modern-day Ukraine. This would, however, be a weapon that is used in the jungles of Guyana. Arrows, again, it's not arrows, it's sabres and it's cannons in the Crimean War. It might be arrows in the Guyana jungle. And then we get references to drums, we get references to buglers. A bugle is a military trumpet that might be played. I think that's historically accurate to the Crimean War. We get muskets, which are a type of gun. That's probably quite accurate as well. And we get cannons, which I know is accurate. So we get a mixture of some historically accurate facts and some moments where the persona gets confused and mixes in a bit of their Guianese culture into this historical retelling. So here we get a conflict of history, one perception of accurate history and a perception of reinvented history. Moving on to stanza 2, the persona, the aguiar, in my opinion, recalls how their grandfather demanded their attention whilst he recited the poem. If you interrupted his grandfather when he was reciting this poem to you, he would say, if you don't all pay me mind, if you don't all pay me attention, I go and gie you a good licking and send you to bed. Here means licking means beating, a good walloping or whacking to discipline his grandkids, to show them that they need to respect him when he recites the poem, and maybe even to show that they need to respect the poem itself, which is a metaphor for the British Empire. Maybe they need to respect the British Empire itself. And here the grandfather appears as quite an authoritative figure, and he uses threats and he uses violence to sort of subdue his grandkids and make them listen to him. Perhaps this is reflective of the British Empire using violence to subdue Guyana. That's something you might want to talk about if you analyse this section of the poem. After we get this sort of violent threat of a good licking, of a beating up, we then get some quite beautiful moments. When the aguiar listens to his grandfather's consonants, the sounds he makes, go beyond his recall, beyond his memory. It almost sounds beautiful, like a whale crying in the sea. There's ideas that he was a sweet sea salter. So again, this idea that he worked in the navy, the aguiar's grandfather was maybe a sailor in the empire, and instead of using maybe like a negative nickname for a sailor, like a salty dog, for example, we get this sweet sea salter title, and the alliteration, the sibilance, shows that the aguiar has beautiful and loving memories of his grandfather, even though he might have hated that his grandfather recalled this old boring poem, Charge of the Light Brigade, and kept trying to force his grandkids to respect the British Empire like he does. The aguiar still has moments where he loves and admires and remembers fondly his grandfather reciting the poem to them. Moving on to stanza 3, we get a sort of a flashback to a moment when one of the grandkids, maybe the aguiar himself, accidentally spoke over his grandfather as he recited Charge of the Light Brigade. And so his grandfather had to start again. And you can imagine all the grandkids going, oh, for goodness sake, he's going to do it again. And they have to try and sit quietly and wait through his recital. But we know the aguiar is a poet, and we get some ideas towards the end of the poem that the aguiar is maybe rewriting his understanding of history, or rewriting his relationship with his grandfather, or his relationship with the idea of the British Empire. And we get this from the phrases face of a blank page. So the aguiar is staring at a blank page and maybe getting writer's block, like many writers do. But then at the very end of the poem, after he's used some lines from Charge of the Light Brigade by Tennyson, we get these final two phrases, to hear and to disobey. And I think this shows the aguiar is willing to hear what his grandfather has to say, but he doesn't have to obey it. He's heard the recital, but he's choosing to disobey and maybe put his pen to paper and rewrite his understanding, rewrite his historical perspective, his cultural identity. There's a conflict there between respecting the history of his grandfather and the British Empire and breaking free and writing his own narrative. So that's what I think is happening in this poem. So what is the poem's message? I think Papati by the aguiar explores his grandfather's loyalty to the British Empire through Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. I think the poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, is almost a metaphor for the British Empire. And by forcing his grandkids to listen to him recite it, the aguiar is hoping to pass on his loyalty to the British Empire to his kids and grandkids. But at the same time, I think in Papati, the aguiar is exploring his ability to break away from his grandfather's viewpoints and history's viewpoints, and exploring the ability that through writing he can create his own narrative, his own understanding of the world. And I think that's quite freeing and beautiful. But I also think it conflicts with what his grandfather wants from him. The poem also explores the messy nature of history. So according to his grandfather, the British Empire was an amazing thing. It gave him a job in the Navy, it gave him purpose. He thinks perhaps going to war and conquering is a good thing to do with his life and wants to pass it on to his grandkids. Whereas the aguiar has a different view. He wants to use his writing ability to rewrite that history, to disobey his grandfather, to write his own narrative. We get this with their relationship as well. In stanza 2, we learn that the aguiar really loves his grandfather and has beautiful memories of him and the way he speaks and the way he recited the poem. But we also learn that the aguiar didn't like to sit and listen to this poem. He didn't like his grandfather, threatening him with a good licking if he didn't sit and listen and obey his instructions and his ideas about the British Empire. So there's definitely conflict between the relationship of the grandfather and the aguiar, the persona. And there's also a conflict of loyalty. The aguiar's grandfather is incredibly loyal to the British Empire. He's recited this poem, he's memorized it, he religiously teaches his grandkids this poem. He wants his grandkids to follow in his footsteps with his ideas of the British Empire. But the aguiar isn't loyal to the British Empire. He didn't grow up during the time where Britain was ruling and reigning over Guyana. He grew up with a different experience, a different sense of freedom and a different sense of loyalty. So there's conflict between the loyalty of the grandfather and the aguiar to the British Empire, I think. So where do we get conflict? The first 2 bullet points deal with contextual conflict, historical conflict, and the final 4 bullet points deal with actual conflict we can find in the poem. So for your historical knowledge, you need to know that the British and the Russians had a conflict called the Crimean War, and in particular the Battle of Balaclava. And that's what Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, is about. And you need to know this poem because it's been referenced in Papati by the aguiar. He even copies some of the lines in stanza 3 from the original poem by Tennyson. Historically, you need to know that Britain conquered Guyana as part of their British Empire, so there would have been some kind of conflict there, either a physical war conflict or a conflict of culture, a conflict of language perhaps. Those are contextual conflicts. Within the poem, there are conflicts of generational loyalty to the empire. So the grandfather is incredibly loyal to the British Empire, whereas the aguiar himself and the persona really isn't. They want to rewrite that history. They want to disobey that loyalty. There's conflict in the retelling of history. The grandfather recites the poem Charge of the Light Brigade to try and show how good perhaps the British Empire is and war is, whereas his grandkids don't have that retelling of history. They don't want to listen to it. They want to hear a different narrative of history. There's conflict in relationships, so whilst the aguiar and the persona love their grandfather, they can't stand the poetic recitals of Charge of the Light Brigade, so there's a tension there. They don't want to get a good-looking licking from their grandfather, but at the same time they have to show him love and respect and want to remember those moments where he recited poetry to them. And there's conflict in this idea of reciting and writing. I think this is quite clever. The aguiar's grandfather can only recite. That means he's memorized what someone else has written and he repeats it. He's telling someone else's story. But the aguiar in stanza 3, we know, is writing his own story. He's writing his own history. He's creating his own poems that maybe in the future other people might recite to their grandkids. So I think there's a conflict between reciting, and don't get me wrong, it's good to memorize a poem. You should memorize some for your exams. But I think there's definitely more power in writing a poem and expressing your own ideas rather than just regurgitating someone else's thoughts and ideas. So let's analyse this poem. As you know, there are linguistic features we can look at, structural features and poetic. The linguistic features I find interesting are the different use of word classes. So these are things like verbs, adjectives and nouns. The use of alliteration or sibilants to draw our attention to certain phrases. Onomatopoeia, particularly used to make references to war and conflict. Personification, a repetition of keywords such as recite and recital. And the use of Creole, which is that phonetic way of spelling words that reflects the Guianese dialect of English, how they speak English. Structurally, the poem is written in free verse. That pretty much means there's no rules. It's written as someone would speak it, perhaps. There's no rhythm or rhyme, no real meter of sorts. There is some structure to the stanzas. There are 3 6-line stanzas. So I would argue this poem is rather unstructured, with the exception of the stanzas. From a poetry point of view, there's some interesting imagery about the jungle, some interesting war sound imagery. We get some enjambment, the running over of one poetic line into the next. We get some end stopping that draw our attention to important lines, and we get some caesura that draw our attention to some important images. Let's explore these. So here I am in stanza 1. You may get your anthology out. You may want to start highlighting and copying down some of this information. This poem is comprised of 6-line stanzas. They don't rhyme, there is no meter, there is no syllabic structure that I can identify. The first word of the poem is when. This conjunction suggests that the aguiar's grandfather did this recital often, and maybe there's a touch of boredom from the aguiar's part at having to listen to another recital. The verb recited is interesting, and it is repeated a lot. When you recite something, you haven't created anything new. You've just memorized what someone else has created, and you're retelling it. We get the proper noun, the name Tennyson, and Tennyson is the name of the poet who wrote The Charge of the Light Brigade. And from the noun see, we can begin to work out that the aguiar's grandfather was maybe some kind of sailor in the merchant navy, that sort of served the British Empire out at sea. I saw companies of redcoats tin soldiering it. Tin soldiering is a compound verb. Compound means 2 words have been joined together, in this case by a dash, and a verb is an action word. So the idea of a tin soldier, which is like a little model figurine, the verb here suggests that at the Battle of Balaclava, the British cavalry were almost like tin soldiers, like toys that some kid has pushed into a battlefield, and they're all going to die. There's almost a childishness to it, which clearly takes away from the historical event in which hundreds of people died. We then get some jungle imagery, which really clashes. The Battle of Balaclava is in modern-day Ukraine. There are no poison-tipped blow darts. There are no arrows. And this really shows a conflict in historical retelling. So the grandfather has obviously told his grandkids the poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, which recounts the Battle of Balaclava in the Crimean War in Ukraine, modern-day Ukraine. But the aguiar's imagination and growing up in Guyana and his childhood experiences and his culture make him imagine as if the battle is being fought with guerrilla tactics in the jungle. So they have different interpretations of this historical event. History is being told from different perspectives. I quite like the onomatopoeia of rattle, yelp, clap, and popping, and this creates sound imagery that really showcases the effects of battle. There is an end stopping with the colon just before we get into that sound imagery through the technique of onomatopoeia. Stanza 2, again, it's a 6-line stanza. There's no real rhyme or meter or any notable pattern. We start with a pronoun and modal verb combination, he'd cut. So we were calling, the aguiar was calling his granddad, but now we've gone over to he. There's sort of familiarity about it. And the modal verb would, he would. This is an elision, the words have been blended together. He would cut short to shout. Modal verbs suggest a probability of something happening. So he would cut short shows that this happens perhaps fairly often. If you spoke over grandfather when he was reciting the Charge of the Light Brigade, he would stop and he would shout at you. I mean, this is quite a powerful verb. I mean, my granddad's never shouted at me. When I think of granddads, I don't really think of shouty people, but the aguiar's granddad would shout at them. If you don't pay me mind, I'm going to give you a good licking and send you to bed. Now, this phrase is written in Creole. I can understand that YU is you, but it's not the standard English spelling of you, which is YOU. And again, with the phrase licking, it's missing the G at the end if you were going to use standard English. This tells me the Aguiar is writing in Guianese Creole, the phonetic dialect that his people would speak in Guyana. And I think this is an interesting addition, and it showcases his cultural heritage. And we know there would be a conflict of culture between Britain and Guyana, and maybe this is being represented here through the Guianese Creole. There's also an enjambment. This line, if you don't pay me mind, I'm going to give you a good licking and send you to bed, is all one sentence, one idea, one piece of dialogue, really. But by running it over 2 lines, the Aguiar gives us a sense that his granddad is almost unstoppable. When you get him starting about reciting or talking about the British Empire, it just runs on and on and on over lines and lines and lines. And we get that impression from the enjambment here. We then get some really beautiful imagery. So maybe the Aguiar's grandfather's dead at the time of writing the poem, but it seems to me that the Aguiar is reflecting on memories he had of his grandfather reading Tennyson's poem to them. And we get some beautiful images. His consonants stretched past recall. The sounds he made of his voice stretched beyond memory. The Aguiar's grandfather is almost timeless when he tells this poem. Sometimes his voice sounds like a whale's crying place. I don't know if you've ever heard of whale song. If you go to YouTube, I'm sure you can Google it and find some whale music. It's quite beautiful and haunting and calming and makes you think of things and brings up memories. The noun polyp. A polyp is something that happens in your body, particularly as you get older, as your body starts going wrong as you grow a bit older. So the Aguiar's grandfather is getting older, but instead of getting older and weaker, his polyps, the growths that grow inside of him, form kingdoms. There's a power, there's a majesty to the Aguiar's grandfather. And we know that the Aguiar's grandfather was a sailor, probably in the merchant navy, probably serving the British Empire. We have clues such as sea and such as sweet sea salter that give us that information. And we get the idea that he might have been shipwrecked into Amerindian care for months. Amerindian is a blending of 2 words, America and Indian, and it refers to the Native Americans, sometimes and wrongly called the Indians, the Native Indians, who initially inhabited North America, Central America, and South America. And we know that Guyana, which is where the Aguiar is from South America, and they would have had some Native Americans, some indigenous people. And that would be part of his cultural identity and cultural heritage. We would sit tight. So here we suggests, the pronoun we suggests there was more than one grandchild who would listen. And by sitting tight, they would sit at their best behaviour and really pay attention to their grandfather, who they love and respect, even though they don't particularly like hearing Tennyson's poem Charge of the Light Brigade and all of his conversations about the British Empire. They sit and listen tight to him because they love him, and they put all their eyes on our sweet sea salter. You could analyse the alliteration of sweet and sea salter. You could maybe take it one step further and look at the sibilants of eyes, sweet, sea, salt, both of which draw our attention to this phrase. Now, when you talk of sailors, there's loads of different nicknames you can give them, and a lot of them maybe aren't particularly nice. But sea salter is a really beautiful phrase to use for someone who is at sea. And that clearly shows they love their grandfather, but there is a conflict in the relationship because they don't like hearing him recite this poem and talking about the empire. We get caesura, which is when you have punctuation in the middle of a poetic line. We get them in certain places to draw our attention to key images or words. We get it into after the whale's crying place, so the reader can take a pause and dwell on that image, that the Aguiar's grandfather's voice is as beautiful as whale song. And we get a comma after all eyes on our sweet sea salter, and it draws our attention to that alliteration or sibilance and this display of love for their grandfather, even though they didn't love the poem he recited or the British Empire that was behind it. In stanza 3, we kind of get a flashback. Someone mistimed once. One of the grandkids spoke out of turn, and then Grandad had to start again. However, at this point, there is a change in tense. All of stanza 1, all of stanza 2, and the first line of stanza 3 is in past tense. But then we get a change into the present tense, and we call the change in poetry a volta. And it starts on this line, these days, and now we're in the present tense. These days, the perfect lined face of a blank page. This is an example of personification. Humans have faces, pages don't have faces. By giving the page a face, a human quality, we have personified it. And what is the face of this blank page? I think it's the aguiar, who is a writer, staring at a blank page and wondering what to write. We know he's a playwright, we know he's a poet. He's thinking of some ideas. What is it that he should write about? And the blank page is startling at first. And I don't know if you've ever had what's called writer's block or blank page syndrome, where you're in the exam and you've been asked a question and you just don't know how to get started. I find it quite reassuring to know that professional writers and university lecturers like the aguiar also struggle with this. It makes me feel a bit more normal in that regard. We get this phrase Papati, and I think, which is of course the name of the poem and something you should refer to. We have the name of the poem Papati, and we get reference to it in the final stanza of the poem. I think Papati has two meanings. I think Papati could be the aguiar's grandfather. I think Papati could also be Papa Tennyson, Alfred Lord Tennyson, who wrote Charge of the Light Brigade. We get the word recitals, which is repetition, because we saw the word recite back in stanza 1. And it really draws this idea that the aguiar's grandfather can only recite the Charge of the Light Brigade and can only recite his historical opinion of the British Empire. Whereas the aguiar, with his blank page and his pen, is able to rewrite a poem and rewrite his understanding of history and his relationship with the British Empire. It has me itching to bring him reeling off in that tongue. The verb itching is interesting. Normally if you're itchy, it's uncomfortable, but here itching means keen. He's incredibly keen and eager to bring the essence of his grandfather's passion for the British Empire and passion for reciting poetry and passion for speaking in his Guyanese Creole tongue. However, he doesn't want to bring that passion and rewrite other people's poems like his grandfather has done, such as Charge of the Light Brigade, where he makes reference to here, honour the charge they made, honour the Light Brigade, Noble 600. The aguiar is okay to hear other people's retelling of history and hear other people's poetry, but he wants to disobey it, the final two words of the poem. And I think he encourages the readers to disobey. Yes, you can learn your grandfather's history. Yes, you can learn the history book's history. But you can also disobey it. If you have the power of writing, you can create your own interpretation of history. You can create your own relationship with the past. And that verb to disobey, I think, is a really powerful idea, to sort of seek freedom in writing, to respectfully listen to people of the past, but to form your own opinion about your country, your culture, your identity, and your future. So, you can make some notes from this video on a physical copy of the poem. I highly recommend doing that. You could also try answering the question, how does the aguiar explore multiple conflicts in Papati? Now, if you rewind back in the video, you will find the conflict section where I talk about conflict with regards to the relationship, conflict with regards to historical retelling, conflicts in the Crimean War, conflicts in the British Empire. There's different aspects of conflicts you can explore. Some are contextual, some are directly from the poem itself. Maybe introduce the poem to me, introduce the aguiar Papati, introduce Alfred Lord Tennyson in Charge of the Light Brigade, and then pick a couple of conflicts you might want to explore. Is there a language quote that particularly helps you explore the relationship conflict, maybe? Is there a structural technique that might help you explore historical narrative conflict, maybe? Is there a poetic technique you want to add into your analysis? And then draw out any conclusions you have of how the aguiar explores multiple conflicts in Papati. If you found this video useful, please consider subscribing to my channel, where I will have analysis on the rest of the conflict poems in the OCR conflict anthology. And feel free to leave a comment if you think I missed anything out, particularly important with this poem, because there's not a lot of analysis out there. I'm presenting these ideas. If you disagree, feel free to let me know in a comment below. Well, thank you for your attention, and I'll see you on the next one.